But because of the nature of the secular thinking about of Jesus' death being around this time of year, you can't help but think and examine the scriptures and reading what happens in his final hours. And then you can't help but think about how it can relate to your own personal life. And if we look at when Jesus is arrested there in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we see him before his accusers, they are letting accusations fly, aren't they? And I'm sure you can think of moments in your life when you may or may not have been accused of something that was not true. I'm sure I can think of one time in particular, my brother Jacob, which a lot of y'all have never met, but my brother Jacob told my daddy that I did something and I was falsely accused of it because Jacob did it, and I'll stand by it to this day. I was falsely accused. I got whipped for it, but I was falsely accused. And when those accusations fly, when you're misunderstood, when the story that's being told about you isn't true, the natural response is to do what? Defend yourself. To speak up. Hey, I didn't do that. Now, hold on. Let me tell you your side of the story. Ever been pulled over by a policeman or something? I can think of one time in particular. I was in college. I was going to John Deere to get parts there in Rockfield, and I was cutting through. And I got pulled over. Sir, you was going 15 over in a school zone. He said the lights were flashing. I turned back, and the lights weren't flashing. I said, no, they weren't. Well, they were when you went through it. Okay. I defended myself and went to court over it, right? Because I was falsely accused of something that had been done. Think about that with Jesus. When Jesus is being accused of things falsely, when the story was being told wasn't true, what does Jesus do? Jesus says nothing. Jesus says nothing. And when we look back at the book of Isaiah, this isn't by accident. This isn't by accident that this happens. If we look at the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, turn there with me. That's where we'll begin. Keep your spot in Matthew, but in Isaiah chapter 53, we see Isaiah talking about the suffering servant. He says, and I'll be reading from the New American Standard, he says, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up like a tender shoot, and out of the root of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one from men whom hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed with him stricken, smitten of God and afflicted. He was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. Verse 7, very important here. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. Now, if there was ever anybody that had something to say in a situation like this, that your life is on the line, Jesus would have had something to say. If we think about the characteristics of Jesus himself, he was 100% man, he was 100% God. He had not sinned. He was perfect in that aspect. And because of that, when they accuse him of something, we know that it wasn't true. But it's because of that silence, that's why Isaiah chapter 53 is so important. That silence is chosen on purpose. And so in this morning, in the time that we have, I want us to think about how, in reality, Jesus said nothing. And how his silence can teach us about faith in ways that words sometimes can't. Because if you think about his silence, Jesus, starting out when we look at this example in the scriptures, Jesus was silent when he was falsely accused. If you're still there in Matthew, if we look at Matthew chapter 26, in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 59, we see Matthew's account of this. Actually, we'll begin in verse 57. It said, "And those who seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders were gathered together. But Jesus was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept crying out to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward, but later on 2 came forward. And one said, 'This man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of the God and rebuild it in 3 days.' And the high priest stood up and said to him, 'Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?' Verse 63, but Jesus kept silent. The high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God.'" Now, verse 64, he does speak, but what he says is powerful. Jesus says to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in on the clouds of heaven." We see these accusations against Jesus. And interestingly enough, each of the gospel accounts have their own version of it. I'd like to, before we proceed any further, I'd like us to look at Mark's example. If you look at Mark chapter 14, Mark chapter 14 and verse 53, this is Mark's account of this same thing. He says, "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and the chief priests and all the elders and scribes gathered together. And Peter had followed at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the officers, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. And they were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy the temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will just build another made without hands.' And even in this respect, their testimony was not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. And the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned the men, saying, 'Do you not answer? What is it that these men testify against you?' But he kept silent and did not answer." I'd venture to say if many of us were in this situation as Jesus was, and we see people coming with false claims against you, and it's obvious from Matthew and Mark both that they ain't got much of a case, do they? It's weak. And when they do come up with something, for facts to be true, stories have to match up, right? We were talking about this downstairs. Youth turkey season's this weekend, right? Now, Austin and Drago's got a bunch of turkeys on their place. I've seen it drive by a bunch of times. Now, if I was tempted, now my temptation is probably different than your temptation, but if I was tempted to cross that line and I see that gobbler fanned out and I belly crawl over there, because I've done that before, and grab that turkey and, what are you laughing for back there? Have you done that before? Grab that turkey, shoot that turkey, grab that turkey and go back across the line. And then Luke and Owen say, "Hey, I saw Caleb in that blue Suburban he's got, and I saw him sneaking across, and he wasn't using a usual gun like he's got. He's got a new one. That's probably the one he'd had." Their stories would have corroborated, right? But if one says that they saw me at 8 o'clock and one saw me at 5 o'clock, and they're telling two different stories, well, I saw he had 2, well, I saw he had 1, and another said he had none, those stories don't match up, right? Kind of like what's going on here with Jesus. They are trying to build a case against him, but they can't even make their stories match up. And yet, because of these false accusations, they're trying to kill him. Now, it's one thing to have a fine for turkey hunting and trespassing. A person might be able to live with that, right? It's another thing if they say, if we catch him, we're going to kill him. Different ball game, ain't it? Different level. Yeah, that's what Jesus is going through. So if someone's coming to me and accusing me of something, and I know that my life is on the line, this old boy is saying, now hold on now. Let me set the record straight. I can prove on my GPS on my phone as to where I was and what I was doing and how I was doing and what I did. And look, I don't even own that gun. And building a case for myself. If your life is in the line, like Jesus's was, you would be trying to defend yourself. But what does Jesus do? He stays silent, doesn't he? And Jesus, as amazing as he is, Jesus shows us something different. For one, he shows that he trusts the Father in all things. Just remember what he said in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but whose will? Your will. He knew that man was in a lost condition. He knew that the blood of bulls and goats was not going to be sufficient and that it was going to take a perfect sacrifice. And he knew that he was the only one that qualified. He knew when Judas comes to him in the Garden of Gethsemane and kisses him on the cheek, he knows that they're going to grab a hold of him. He knows that in the next 12 hours what's getting ready to happen to him. He knows, as we talked last week, that when they parade him through the streets and are shouting Hosanna, he knows that eventually this is going to end in him dying. And not just dying, suffering. And yet he stays silent. He stays quiet. If we look in the book of Psalms, the psalmist there makes a point about this. In the book of Psalms, chapter 38. In the book of Psalms, chapter 38 and verse 12, he says, those who seek my life lay snares for me, and those who seek to injure me have threatened destruction, and they devise treachery all day long. I can think we can say that the Pharisees were devising treachery, weren't they? But like a deaf man I do not hear, and I am like a mute man who does not open his mouth. Yes, I am like a man who does not hear, and whose mouth there are no arguments. Why? For I hope in you, O Lord. That's Jesus. He knew, and we'll get to more verses about this when we get to the book of Hebrews here after a while. But when we see Jesus, we see an example of someone who had faith that we need to try to imitate. Not my will, but your will. That's why he was silent. That's why when he was falsely accused, he did it because it was the will of the Father. He did it because he knew that without him being quiet, we didn't have a chance. Now that's love. That's compassion. That's obedience to the Father. And that's an example that many of us need to work on every day. And to build on this, I think we can think about, too, Jesus was silent when he was mocked and ridiculed. So not only is he having false stories told about him, now he's having things. Now he's being made fun of in the process. If you flip over to Luke's account, in the book of Luke, chapter 23. In the book of Luke, chapter 23, and verse 8. It says, now Herod was very glad to see when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. He's thinking of him almost as a novelty, wasn't he? And he questioned him at some length, but he, speaking of Jesus, answered him nothing. He stayed silent. And the chief priests and the scribes are standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod and his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. When we think of who Jesus was, what he could have done. Herod's wanting to see a spectacle. And no doubt his curiosity was sparked. Maybe Herod had never had the opportunity to see Jesus. We'll give him the credit of that. But when you've heard stories of the man that fed 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes, you've heard the stories of the man that has went and made the lame man walk, or made the blind man see, or even possibly have heard the story of him raising Lazarus from the dead. Okay, do a trick for me. That's what Herod's attitude here is, isn't it? Okay, puppet, you are at my will. Do something. Jesus could have said, "Who do you think I am?" Could have defended himself. He could have done a miracle so much that it killed Herod on the spot and said, "Who's laughing now?" That's what Caleb would have been tempted to do. But what does Jesus do? He is meek. And when we think about what this true definition of meekness is, meekness literally means strength under control. A lot of times I think we get confused and think that meek and weak are the same, but meek and weak is just they sound the same, right? But they could be more polar opposites. It is strength under control. Well, look at another example of what happens to him at this same time. Go over to Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter 27, he's again being mocked. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 27, it says, "So the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down and before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they spat on him. And they took the reed and began to beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took off the scarlet robe and they put on his own garments back on him. And they led him away to crucify him." I was watching a video yesterday, actually, of a podcast. They were this guy that they were interviewing was supposed to be a New Testament scholar of some sort. Can't remember his exact title. But he brought to the show what he called a Bethlehem thorn. Now, I'm not saying that this is what they used in Jesus, but it was a very good representation to make sense. That they had taken this type of thorn that was found in the Middle East there and had made a crown out of it. Now, these thorns were like that. And it was more or less like a cap that you could put on the average man head. And even in grabbing it with their hands of trying to show it off to the camera, it's trying to hurt them. And the guy makes the point. He said, now, and he's in the interview, he says, and you can feel in this, he said, they feel like nails, don't they? Because they're so rigid. Notice what it says that he does there. He says that they placed it on his head and they pushed it down. They beat it down. Now, granted, I've never seen a Bethlehem thorn. That's what he said that was called. But I have seen a locust tree. I'm sure Keith's seen them out logging. If you're turkey hunting, that's the last tree you want to lean up against is a locust tree. And if you ain't ever seen a locust tree, boy, they've got big old thorns on them too, don't they? And they hurt. I remember one time going through the woods and I tripped on something, which I am pretty clumsy sometimes, but I tripped on something, and what was I falling towards? A locust tree. Boy, you duck and roll quick in, don't you? It hurts. And Jesus, in His mockery, remember what we just said, He was 100% man, but He was also 100% God. He feels pain just like you and I do. He's being falsely accused of things that He did not do. He's being ridiculed. He's being mocked. He's being spat on. You can get a criminal charge for that in the United States now, by the way, right? Yet that's what they're doing to Him. Hail, King of the Jews, who are you? Hit Him a little bit harder. He's already been bleeding now. Hit Him a little bit harder. And you think of the temptation that would come of, I don't have to go through this. And you can think of the angels just sitting there at the ready. All He's got to do is say the word, boys, and it's over. Right? He has that power. Yet what does He do? He stays silent. And He does that for me and for you. You know, if we go back to what we read in the book of Isaiah, go back here again. If you go back to the book of Isaiah chapter 50, though, this time. In Isaiah chapter 50, He says, I gave my back to those who strike me, and my cheek to those who pluck out the beard. I did not cover my face from humiliation and spitting. Verse 7, for the Lord God helps me. Therefore I am not disgraced. Therefore I have set my face like flint, and I know that I will not be ashamed. Set His face like flint. You ever dealt with an arrowhead? Pretty hard, right? It's the reason the Indians chose it, right? Set like flint. Unmoved. He doesn't let his emotions take control of him, and he stays silent for you. Because let me tell you, if he would have been the average man, he would have said, I can't take it no more. How much more are you going to beat me? How much more do I have to take? Yet He loved you for some reason. And He wanted you to be with Him for some reason, because He knew that God and sin can't, what, Thomas? Coexist. And He knew that we were in a sinful condition, and because of the love that He has for us, He stayed silent. Let me tell you, I've been in situations, we all have, where someone made fun of you over something, and you didn't like it. And a lot of times when you're younger, you let your emotions take place of it, and it's rough and tumble, no hell's bar, right? I ain't going to take it no more. That's what Jesus could have done. And you want to pick a fight with somebody? Let me tell you, picking a fight with the Son of God isn't who you want to pick a fight with. But He did it for you. He did it for me. You know, when we think about this, we also think about how Jesus was silent before authority. You know, if we look over back in the book of Matthew chapter 27, Matthew chapter 27 and verse 12, we see Him brought before Pilate. Matthew chapter 27 and verse 12, and it says, and while He was being accused by the chief priests and elders, He did not answer. And Pilate said to Him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? And He did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. Remember, we look at Luke. When Herod requests of him, he says nothing. Now, if you flip over to the book of John, in John chapter 19, we do see Jesus speak. We do see Jesus speak. In John chapter 19 and verse 9, it says, He entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, where are you from? Jesus gave him no answer. And Pilate said to him, "Do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and I have the authority to crucify you?" And Jesus says to him, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Pilate makes an excellent point here. One explanation to the man in charge could have changed everything. Pilate's looking for an answer. Pilate, at this point, wants to try to do the right thing, doesn't he? He wants to be just. And one argument with Pilate and the Pharisees could have changed it all, could have changed the outcome. And yet Jesus says almost nothing. And it's not because he's intimidated, but it's because he understands where this real authority comes from. Because Jesus wasn't impressed by the power that could just affect his body. He knew that the power of his Father outruled any earthly ruler. Because remember what he said in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not my will, but whose? Your will. Your will. And you know, that takes an incredible amount of faith. You know, we think about that with people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of not bowing to people in authority. And you know, I can't help but think about, you know, in Psalms chapter 37, where he talks about committing our ways to the Lord and trusting in Him. You know, it's because of the love that He had for us and the faith that He has that He's able to do this. If you look over in the book of Hebrews chapter 12, he says, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, he says, "Fixing your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, for who the joy set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame." Endured, went through, put up with for you. But what was the result of it? It says now that He's at the right hand of God. But also, when Jesus did speak, He spoke when it mattered most. Last night I was sitting there studying, and I went through the 4 gospel accounts of what we see here. And if you take from when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane till He draws His last breath on earth at the crucifixion, depending on the version, the best I could count, He only speaks 240 to 260 words. That's not very many. So when He does talk, it's not because He doesn't have words. We've seen, take the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 and 6. He obviously is eloquent. He obviously can speak. But the fact that He only speaks 240, let's say, words, it's because He was intentional and directive with what He says. And when He does speak, it's never to defend Himself. More often than not, it's for others. You know, when we look over in the book of Luke, turn to the book of Luke chapter 23. In Luke chapter 23 and verse 34. We see Him speaking there. It says, and Jesus was saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Go down just a few more verses in verse 43. This is after the thief on the cross asks Him to remember him. He says, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." Go down to verse 46. When He dies, He says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." You look over in the book of John, in John's account, John chapter 19. These are the last words of Jesus. John chapter 19 and verse 26. It says, and Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, and he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. And he said to the disciple, behold your mother. Back to chapter 18. In chapter 18 and verse 36, when he's talking to Pilate, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. When he speaks with intention. When he speaks, what he says is of value. Think about that with us today. I don't know how many times that you've been to church. I don't know how many times that you've heard the gospel. But I do know this, that there's not one person in this building that can tell me when their final moment is. And there's also not one person in this building that knows when Jesus is going to come back. There ain't. But when Jesus says in Mark chapter 16 and verse 16, one of the most powerful words that we see spoken in the New Testament by Jesus, he says, he who has believed and has been baptized shall be saved. Now let me tell you, that's an important word right there. He had just got done telling them in verse 15 to go on in all the world. But when Jesus speaks, He is the Son of God. He says it for intentionality. He ain't up there talking for the sake of talking. So when He says to you, I want you to be with me, come and follow me, here's how you do that, you better be listening. Because we see that He stayed silent when He needed to stay silent. But when He speaks, brother, you better be listening. You better lock in and be ready to live for Him. Because that's what He wants. He wants you. And so when He speaks and says, come to me, all that are weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest, as we see in the book of Matthew chapter 11. He means it. And when He says that you need to believe and be baptized, He means it. Because He is intentional with what He says. Because Jesus could have spoken, Jesus could have argued, He could have defended Himself, yet His silence teaches us a lesson. That when He does speak, we better be listening. Are you listening? Maybe you're here this morning and you've heard lesson after lesson. You've heard lessons from me. You've heard lessons from Barry. You've heard lessons from Jared, whoever. And you've come over and over and you've never come and given your life to God. But when you read in the Scriptures, you see what Jesus says in His words, what to do to how to become a Christian, and you ain't acted upon it. Let me tell you, you ain't ready. And we see Him speaking to the Holy Spirit and through Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21, He echoes what we see in Mark chapter 16 verse 16. Baptism now saves you. It ain't going to be nothing that you do on your own. It's Jesus that does the same. It's because of His death and what He endured on that cross and the fact that He did resurrect from the dead that we have the hope of anything. If there's anybody that has done things in their life that they don't deserve to go to heaven, it's this old boy. But because of the justification, and when you think about what justification means, the justification really is because Jesus died, it's made it as just as if I've never sinned. And because you can act upon what He says, if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and you're willing to repent, quit living for yourselves and start living for Him, and acting upon when He did speak and about what He did speak, and you're willing to confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that He is who He said He was, and that He does now reign with heaven eternal, you can come to Him in baptism, burying the old man, rising up the new. I've said it before, there's lots of dead bones in this water back here because there's lots of dead people. Because they left the old man behind and rose up new. That can be you today. Maybe you've done that in the past, but you've forgotten the words that Jesus said. You've forgotten to live how He said to live, and you haven't been walking on the straight and narrow. I get it, we all make mistakes, but I tell you what, it's because of Him and the words that He said and the actions that He had that we have hope, that I have hope. And He says in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 9 that if He is willing to forgive us if we come to Him. Don't let eternity sneak up on you. Let's all leave here this morning ready for the Lord to come back. If there's any need for salvation this evening or this morning, come forward, we stand and sing. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions about the things we're studying, send us a message at www.caneyvillechurchofchrist.com. You can also find a complete library of all of our sermons on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We look forward to studying the Word of God with you.